Hello and welcome to the Centre Think Tank interview series in Conversation. My name is Torrin Wilkins, the Director of Centre Think Tank. Today we'll be discussing the future of centrist and moderate politics. This includes the 2011 Canadian federal election, the future of centrism in Canada today, and in the wider global context. With me today to explore these issues further, I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Ignatieff. Michael has a wide range of experience, including as the former leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. He's also a professor of history at Central European University, having also held senior positions at Harvard, Toronto, Cambridge, and Oxford universities. He also holds numerous honorary doctorates and has authored books on human rights, some of which I read during my own time at university on the same subject. With his time in academia, political life, and his openness to discussing the challenges for modern liberalism, there are few better people to discuss the future of centrism and liberalism with. So thank you so much for being with me today, Michael.
Nice to be here, Torrin.
So, for my first question, I want to cast your mind all the way back to 2009 when you were first elected as Liberal Party leader. And in 2009, Inside Story described your views as squarely in the middle of the Liberal Party spectrum, a leader who can balance the social justice preferences of progressive liberals and the more conservative business liberals. So, do you think that was a fair description of your politics at the time? And is that description still true of you today?
I think that is a fair description, and it's a good description of my politics. I'm what would be called in Canada and in North America a big tent liberal. My sense is that all politics is coalition politics, especially liberal politics, especially if you're in the center. So that would be a fair a fair description. Um, I would go on to make a little distinction, however, between a liberal and a progressive.
Mhm.
I'm a liberal. I'm not a progressive. That is to say, if I have to choose between equality and liberty, and sometimes you do have to choose, I choose liberty. And one of the criticisms I make of the liberalism that I've lived with most of my life is that we haven't been as quick to acknowledge the difference between a progressive tradition and a liberal tradition. We're very close. We work together all the time. In Canadian politics, there's a thing called the New Democratic Party, who are progressives, social democrats, and we're liberals. But we blur the distinction at our peril because politics is all about choices, and occasionally you have to make choices, and the choices are often between how much liberty and how much equality. And a liberal is always on the side of liberty.
And you were, of course, very open after 2009 and going into 2011 and that election campaign about the successes, but also the challenges. And you ran as a self-described centrist and moderate candidate. And it was an election, I think, dominated by strong figures on the left with Jack Layton and the NDP, and on the right with Stephen Harper and the Conservatives. So do you have any lessons from that campaign about the difficulties of running from the centre ground? And would you position yourself slightly differently in retrospect, or do you still think that that was the way to go and it just may not have been the election?
I think that's a good description of 2011. Let's remind our viewers and listeners that it ended in pretty comprehensive defeat for me. I mean, the party lost. I lost my seat. We were reduced to a rump. And remember, this had been a governing party for most of Canada's 20th century, and it's a governing party now with Mr. Carney and Mr. Trudeau. So it was a real shock for a governing party to be clobbered the way we were. And we were between two millstones, a polarizing right-wing figure, Mr. Harper, and a polarizing left-wing figure, Mr. Layton, and they both did a much better job than I did in defining themselves. So I own that. I mean, I take responsibility for that. I don't think it means that centrism is, there's no place in the center. There's a lot of talk to the effect that there is, but I think most voters are actually in the center. To the degree that they think about politics, they're cautious, pragmatic, small c conservative in their aversion to risk. Um, and most voters don't give politics a hell of a lot of attention. I don't want to disparage voters. They're pretty smart, I learned. But you have to go to where they are, and where they are is, I think, cautious, basically. Um, but I think the problem I had was that I didn't define the center clearly enough. And by that, I mean I didn't define it against a right-wing conservatism that, in my view, hadn't met the challenge of the 2008, 2009 financial crisis at all well. Um, in fact, the conservative government only survived because we insisted that they inject $60 billion into the Canadian economy. That was a condition of my support for their budget. But they got the credit for that, not me. I think I behaved responsibly in that regard, but they took the credit. So instead of attacking them in 2011 for what they failed to do, I boxed myself in because I told them what to do and they'd done it, right? And on the left, Jack Layton, very effective politician, scooped up our seats in Quebec by making a more effective appeal to um, Quebec, which always votes more to the left than the rest of Canada for excellent social justice reasons. And so I got squeezed in the middle. But it led me to think that this isn't, my story isn't a story about the death knell of centrism. It's a story about the fact that I wasn't able to define myself against two alternatives, both of which I reject. And so you live and learn. But I noticed recently that Rob Yelton in the Netherlands, D66, a party I know well, and I know him very well, 38-year-old guy, has shown again that that kind of centrism is very attractive when you've had a flirtation with Wilders and the far right, and the social democratic left seems exhausted. Suddenly, up the middle comes a liberal centrism that can be very, very attractive to voters. Um, they're tired of the provocation. They're tired of provocative politics. That is politics that's constantly, basically sustained by attacking and mischaracterizing the other side. Most people, I think, don't like that kind of politics instinctively. So if you can grab hold of their attention and say, I'm not going to play that kind of politics, I think you can get a hearing.
Because one of the things that's interesting about D66 is that they made very bold promises in the election. For instance, the 10 new cities pledge, which I think was a really good way of capturing people's imagination and saying, this is what we're going to do. So is that part of the challenge centrism faces, is that sort of sometimes perhaps that lack of saying, here's the vision that we have for the future and what it can look like, which I think sometimes can often be easier for those on the left and right to say, this is the direction I would like to go in.
Yes, I think you don't want to have a centrism that becomes a synonym for cautious moderation. You want to have a centrism that thinks big and above all refuses to categorize people as being left or right. I'm very left on moral issues, um, on immigration, I guess. I'm pretty left on social justice issues. I just don't think you can have freedom in a society if you don't have a basic granite under everybody's feet, so nobody goes hungry, everybody gets an education. I mean, all those kind of basic commitments I've always been, but I'm fiscally conservative. I just don't. You got to pay for it,
Hmm.
and you can't transfer debt to the next generation. And we've been doing it shamelessly for a long time. My party, however, managed in the 90s to cut its deficit basically in half, showed the whole world that you can take an out of control deficit and get it under control by very, very tough fiscal compression. And it was brutal. But here's the payoff. We then won the next 3 or 4 elections because Canadians understood that if they were going to pay taxes, they wanted the taxes to fund hospitals and schools, not debt service. That's the key. And so there's a kind of centrism here that is, you know, socially progressive but fiscally conservative that I think people will be very attracted to. But to get back to your original point, it's got to be ambitious. Mark Carney, right at the moment, is an absolute centrist politician of the kind I'm describing, and he's just about to announce a whole new series of nation building projects that are huge in their impact. 10, 15-year projects to basically get our productivity problems solved, get some crucial national infrastructure built. This is thinking big, but it comes from a centrist. And I think that's the right model.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's a very good explanation of centrism, of socially liberal, but also fiscally conservative, balance the books, but also some big ideas in there. So on that side of things, I can say, at least from our position as a centrist think tank in the UK, I think we share that model of what centrism looks like. And one issue actually that has been a debate for a long time in the UK, and you yourself have voiced support for, is of course electoral reform. And one of the reasons that I think it's grown support in the UK is the idea that it can help to moderate the political system by encouraging more cooperation between different parties. Yet that is also a reform that Justin Trudeau didn't deliver after promising it. And of course, Mark Carney hasn't actually promised it at all. So why do you think that electoral reform has proven so difficult for people in the political centre who might naturally support the basic principles behind electoral reform?
Mm. I think the problem reveals itself in places like Belgium and Holland. Um, there are certain kinds of packages of electoral reform that result in the proliferation of parties. I can't remember how many parties there are in Holland, but it's more than a dozen, right?
Mm.
And that makes coalition formation intensely difficult. It improves representation in the sense that it means that um, every tendency gets potentially an electoral team that can carry that tendency forward. But it makes coalition formation and government formation after the election much more difficult. And sometimes I think in Belgium recently, it took them a year and a half to get a government. Um, Whereas the electoral system that I ran under in Canada, first past the post, rather like the British one, the one thing to be said for it is that it forces the 2 big parties or the 3 big parties to form their coalitions before the election, as it were, and to get everybody in the big tent and say, and there are all kinds of liberals in Canada, and but we all run under the same red banner, and then we fight in caucus about what we want to do, but we're held together. So and the problem with electoral reform in Canada, but also in Spain and Belgium and probably even in Holland and maybe in Britain, is the risk that it increases polarization rather than reducing it. It increases regional polarization. In our country, the risk that you have if you get away from these big national parties is that you start to get regional parties. We already have them in Quebec. We have a party that basically only represents Quebec, and that makes running our country very difficult. But imagine what it's like if you change the electoral system and had a British Columbia party, a Saskatchewan party, a Manitoba Party, an Alberta Party, then the trouble of keeping a federation together, which is always a problem, becomes possibly unsolvable. And that's why everybody's cautious about electoral reform. Apart from the usual banal reason which every political leader has, which is it good for me or not? That's one set of calculations, which obviously plays very strongly in, say, Justin Trudeau's decision not to go for the electoral reform he promised. I simply don't know, looking at you honestly, what system of electoral reform I propose in my country. I'm in favor of it because here's why. I would like a system in which my party, the Liberal Party of Canada, racks up some seats in Alberta. And I'm willing to go for a reform that makes that easier on the understanding that the consequence is that it makes it easier for the Conservatives to win seats in my heartland, that is downtown Toronto, right?
Mm.
So, and the reason I think that's good is that it's good for the national unity of the country that a national party gets representation in Alberta. And we have been shut out as a party from the West, the Canadian West, which is the future of the country, right? And because of population distribution, we have huge chunks of seats delivered to us in Ontario and Quebec. And this leaves the rest of the country feeling excluded and left out of liberal governments. So I'm not saying that first past the post solves the problem. I'm admitting that, in fact, the electoral system exacerbates our national unity problem. But I have yet to hear of a political solution to the problem that I can support, because the objective is the national unity of the country. And it should be the objective in Britain
Mm.
that you don't want to have the country ending up more divided than it is. And so it's a little bit of cling to nurse for fear of something worse.
It's a very good description of it, and I suppose it goes back to our conversation before the interview about sort of it's a good idea if you get it right
Yes,
at the end
exactly.
of the day, which is electoral
Exactly.
reform.
Exactly. That's the lingo of the think tank. Yes. All no, it all depends on implementation and
Yeah.
the consequences of implementation. No question.
So another subject, and I suppose it does link quite well to that one, is about the political extremes. And at the moment, we have a resurgence of people on the extremes, populists and authoritarians as well. And you've seen this, of course, up close at Central European University, where you yourself confronted Viktor Orban's assault on academic freedom. But we've also seen Donald Trump's success in the United States and the rise of far-right movements in Europe and beyond. So, what can centrists and moderates do to counter these movements that often offer very simple answers to what are very complex questions?
I think everybody's asking this question, and nobody has terrific answers, and I certainly don't. Um, I mean, what centrists are doing, which is the right thing to do, is say populists have no solutions. I mean,
Mm.
you know, um, Mr. Farage, I understand you are hostile to immigration. Fine, many people are hostile to immigration,
Mm.
but have you got any solution to the boats, actually? I mean, come on. If you want to be prime minister, you can't just blow smoke here. You're going to have something that's better than what Mr. Starmer's got on offer. So there's some of that you can do. Simply go at the solutions and do what any good political party does, which is bang away at their inadequacies until people start to listen. So that's one thing. I think another thing is to do some honest reflection on some of our failings. I mean, I'm one thing I look at, I lived in Britain for 20 years, so I don't know whether that gives me the right to talk about Britain or not, but I'm pretty fond of the place, and Canada's a British parliamentary democracy, so we're kind of we're collegial. I think liberals centrists like me, both in Canada and in Britain and in the United States, need to look much more critically at the liberal state. One of the things that I'm of an age that, we're the heirs of the Roosevelt Revolution and the creation of the post-war liberal state, the Beveridge state, the Attlee state. Um, these were enormous achievements, but they're big machines that took a huge percentage of national income and then tried to create, social justice and empowerment and opportunity for, people who'd gone through the Depression and, felt all the bitterness of exclusion. The liberal state accomplished a tremendous amount. And then it got very big, very unresponsive, very bureaucratic, and very centralized, with losses to democratic accountability, with losses to popular control, and with losses above all in simply efficiency and effectiveness. And I think centrists have to own that. We're believers in the use of state power and not nearly critical enough of the enormous failures that ordinary people encounter um, in hospitals. I mean, um, a couple of years ago, my brother died in a Canadian hospital. If you're a liberal centrist like me, one of your articles of faith is that the health service is going to look after you and is the kind of incarnation of our interpersonal concern that liberals and centrists believe in. Well, you see your brother lying on a gurney in a hospital corridor for hours, and you see him then get care that is just not well organized, not well channeled, very inefficient. You think to yourself, how did we get here? We're pouring huge amounts of money into a system that just doesn't seem to be delivering the kind of care that either patients or nurses or doctors seem to want. And I think everybody's experience of the NHS is an uneasy combination of worship for the ideal with deep discomfort of what it's like actually to be there. And that's a part of the larger pathology of the liberal state. I mean, one of the things that strikes me in England is the incredible centralization of authority in Whitehall. I mean, just is this wise? I mean, just why can't, you know, big metropolitan areas like Manchester and Birmingham and Edinburgh and Cardiff have much more taxation authority, much more responsibility? Why can't London be much more self-governing? Um, I mean, I understand some of the problems. You want to have fiscal discipline for the whole United Kingdom. You don't want to lose that. Fine, okay. But the centralization of authority down into 10 Downing Street puts impossible pressure on the Prime Minister, possible pressure on the parliamentary system. And I mean, that's the beginning of the problem. The other problem, speaking very candidly as someone who was in the House of Commons for 5 years in Canada, was the total marginalization of the legislative chamber in most of our democracies. Um, it's a little better in Britain. Parliament does hold the government to account, and question period is a serious moment of democratic accountability. But boy, oh boy, it sure ain't in Canada. And so we've got real problems about democratic accountability in our institutions and real problems with the excessive power, excessive concentration of power in the liberal state. And somewhere in here, we've got to do a lot of work about that favors decentralization, that gives more power to citizens' assemblies, that deliberately pushes problems out to the public and says, what do you think? Let's get together. Here are the facts. We need you to help us shape a solution that's democratic and has accountability. And we're not doing that. And we're instead loading the burden of decision on overworked, overtried, overpressured politicians at the top of an over-centralized system. And I think we're heading we're heading for breakdown, really. I just don't see how this is sustainable, especially against the background of the social media age and the incredible pressure on decision makers literally every moment that turns every political decision into basically a question of how you perform the issue in front of the public to survive literally another day. And there's something very seriously wrong with our democracy as a result, and it's consuming the legitimacy of liberal freedom in ways that I think every centrist should be concerned about. And somehow we have to stand up and say, this is a problem, and here's the kind of solution that we would propose. And a lot of it means giving power away, right? Number one. Number two, pulling the state back, you know, trimming the state down, saying there are things that the state should not be doing. We should get out of certain businesses and focus on where the state really needs to be present, which is in unlocking productivity, building infrastructure that sustains economic growth. The other thing that the state needs to be doing and isn't doing is controlling economic power. I mean, I don't know what kind of a problem that is in Britain, but boy, in the States, you just think it's completely out of control. And democracy is being destroyed by the inability of the liberal state to use its power to break up monopolies, to force competition into the system. I mean, the great wisdom of centrist liberalism was, you know, markets are pretty good things if there's real competition. It's good for customers. It's good for freedom. It's good for innovation. And we've got oligopoly piled on top of monopoly that I think is throttling innovation, is throttling competition, is throttling the very price system. And all of this, it seems to me, is a huge agenda that centrists need to take over because conservatives want to basically, you know, enrich the rich. The the left and far left is concerned absolutely appropriately with its constituency, but a centrism that says there's some issues that concern all citizens, rich, poor, entitled, disinherited, all of us are suffering from these pathologies of the liberal state and the failure of the liberal state to get itself under control and the failure of the liberal state to control the market. And I think there's an agenda there. And so there we go.
Well, I mean, especially on devolution. I mean, I wrote a paper called Devolution Revolution, so definitely down my views of politics there. So I'm always happy to hear another enthusiast for UK devolution. And I know you've spoken a little bit about it there, but of course you have been very open about where centrism and liberalism have gone wrong in the past, and you've described parts of modern liberalism as condescending, know-it-all, dismissive, and intolerant. So, how did liberalism end up like this, and how can we fix modern liberal centrism?
Well, I think it's become a politics of virtue. And it became that for excellent reasons. I mean, I'm of a generation that lived through, I think, the proudest achievement of liberal centrism, which was the the equality, the diversity revolution. It begins in the late 50s, early 60s with immigration, the transformation of the ethnic composition of all our societies. Around the same time, the mid 60s, the United States, Britain, Canada begin to admit large numbers of immigrants from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Asia. And my view of this is that it powered economic growth and it created a new kind of society, which we call the multicultural society. And it was terrifically good and politically problematic because beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of white Britons and white Americans and white Canadians woke up and said, "Hey, what's happened to my neighborhood? Who who asked these people? I mean, who asked me whether these people should be here?" And so there's been a democratic deficit in the multicultural revolution, which we didn't see. I'm a 100% in favor of it. And I was born in a town where most people in 1950s looked like me. And now in 2034, I will be a minority in my own city. And that seems to me a good thing. Toronto is a much stronger and more interesting, dynamic and effective place than it was in my childhood. But there was a democratic deficit connected with the establishment of it. So that's kind of one issue. The other part of the liberal achievement was, um, you know, the uh, the reforms that emancipated women, um, the reforms that slowly, painfully gave um, gay citizens equal rights. I mean, I've officiated some gay marriages, and it's pretty moving stuff. I mean, these people, my friends, my buddies, suddenly feel, I'm an equal, and so these are huge achievements, um, and um, liberals and centrists, I think, are rightly proud of them. The immigration revolution, the feminist revolution, the gay revolution, all good, but they have produced a backlash from people who feel threatened by them. So there's a democratic legitimacy problem that they have. And because they aroused resistance, I think a lot of liberals, and you see this particularly in the academy, began to enforce a kind of politics of virtue. Everybody should believe that diversity is a very good thing. Everybody should believe that feminism is a very good thing. Everybody should think that gay rights is a very good thing. And anybody who says that questions any of that, and then the trans revolution is another place where this suddenly blew up into flames in Britain. Anybody who's against trans people is somehow illiberal, reactionary. We enforce the politics of virtue. All reasonable people should think the same on these issues. That, I think, began to feel like tyranny for a lot of people. And I don't think the right wing is entirely wrong to say that in the universities that I've taught in, say Harvard at 2000 to 2015, it looked like political correctness. I mean, there were things you didn't say, there were things you did say, and and here's the cost to centrist liberalism. We forgot about freedom. I mean, it's simple. We forgot about freedom. Freedom is not a nice warm bath. Freedom is listening to stuff you don't want to hear. Freedom is allowing people to say things you think are absolutely crazy and wrong and morally repugnant. But that's freedom. And we impose a kind of culture of virtue here, for which I think there's been a huge price. And needless to say, Trump and these people have now clobbered the universities in the United States because of it. And I'm totally opposed to what Trump has done. But I kind of understand that we gave him a certain pretext. And so we're now in a battle for the future of these institutions that seem to me to be critical to the future of liberalism. I mean, if you don't have free universities, you don't have a free society. But we've got to do some things on the liberal centrist side to restore that freedom. So those are some of the things that I think we need to think about. Um, and and I've been in too many rooms in my own university, Central European University, watching students shout down things they didn't want to listen to, disrupt meetings because they disapproved of a speaker. And I have confronted them directly as rector. I fought back right there at the scene. but had a queasy sense that nobody understands what's at stake. I mean, we've got to have a society where people can speak, listen to what makes them uncomfortable, angry, and morally dismayed, and not stop the other person from speaking. And there's been simply too much speech suppression by, you know, people who think that their own convictions are self-validating and can't be argued with. And this is Gaza, this is Israel, this is a whole gamut of issues. And um, so a centrist liberal has to cling to freedom and defend it against the right, against the left, and uphold it passionately because nobody else will.
Hmm. So for my final question, of course, we've been touching on it a few times in this interview, but of course, the world now, I think, is more than ever dominated by quick fixes and perhaps sound good, simple answers, as I'd call them, showing that, I think solving deep-rooted problems right now um, is hard, but unfortunately, I think we are in a position where it seems almost impossible, especially when people make it sound like they can be fixed easily and then they're not.
Sure.
So, what advice would you give to organizations like our own working to create those solutions? And do you see that kind of evidence-based problem-solving work as important for renewing the political center ground?
Oh, I think there's no question that a strong politics has to free itself from this kind of performative news cycle in which you're you're playing rhetorical games on an incredibly tight circuit. This is actually destroying politics. What you have to have in a centrist politics is a politics of reality, a politics that starts from here's what the problem is, and here's what our best guess is as to how to fix it based on evidence. And that's the only way you can persuade people to solve or to lend their support to solutions which are of necessity long term. You know, countries have done great things, but all of them have taken a long time. And the problem with politics is getting the time to get the solution done. You know, Britain has very substantial productivity problems. Some of them can be solved actually with quick fixes, with regulatory change, bonfire of the regulations, freeing up innovators to do to bring solutions to the market. But some of it is much longer term. Skill training of adolescents, reform of education, infrastructure investment that actually adds to the productivity of the country, support for science and innovation at universities and in the private sector. You know, a long-term joined up productivity strategy is a 10, 15-year project for a whole society. And it has to be sustained by really, joined up research that studies what other countries are doing on the productivity challenge and tries to use the best ideas. What I've learned from looking at that is that, you know, there are solutions, but they're all reality based. And so think tanks are essential to sustaining reality based politics in a in a media environment in which politics is all performative and empty of substance. So you got your hands full. Big job.
I think that's a very good way to end the interview is that we certainly have our hands full with that sort of level of convincing people. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Michael, and for discussing everything with me.
Pleasure.